Imagine waking up one morning and your GPS doesn't work. Your phone has no signal, banks are offline, military communications are dead, air traffic control is blind, and every satellite-dependent system on Earth, from weather forecasting to nuclear early warning, has gone dark simultaneously. That is not science fiction. That is the exact scenario the United States military just finished wargaming, and the weapon at the center of that simulation belongs to Russia. This is not a rumor. This is not speculation. This is an active intelligence alert coming from the highest levels of the American military, confirmed by the head of U.S. Space Command himself just days ago. Russia is reportedly developing a nuclear anti-satellite weapon, a device designed to be placed in orbit and detonated, sending out a pulse of radiation and electromagnetic energy powerful enough to destroy thousands of satellites at once. And the U.S. government is now openly saying this threat is real, serious, and one they simply cannot tolerate. Let's start with the man who is sounding the alarm, because this is not a mid-level analyst or a think tank report. This is General Stephen Whiting, the commander of the United States Space Command. Speaking at the 2026 Space Symposium in Colorado Springs just this week, General Whiting made his most direct public statement yet on the Russian threat. He said the United States is very concerned about reports that Russia is thinking about placing a nuclear anti-satellite weapon into low Earth orbit. His exact words were these: Russia intends to deploy a weapon that would hold at risk everyone's satellites in low Earth orbit, and that would be, in his words, an outcome we just couldn't tolerate. Whiting was careful not to confirm the specific intelligence sources behind the warning, but he did not walk it back either. He called it a report they are taking with the utmost seriousness, and the actions that the U.S. military has already taken, which we will get to in a moment, make very clear that behind closed doors, this threat is being treated as one of the most dangerous developments in modern military history. So what exactly is this weapon, and how would it work? According to multiple intelligence assessments and defense analysts, Russia is developing a nuclear-armed anti-satellite system, known in military terminology as a nuclear ASAT. The core mechanism is not complicated to understand. A nuclear warhead would be placed into low Earth orbit aboard a Russian satellite. When detonated, the explosion would generate an electromagnetic pulse, an EMP, of catastrophic intensity. That EMP would instantly fry the electronics of every satellite within its line of sight. But that is only the first wave of destruction. The second wave is even more dangerous and far longer lasting. A nuclear explosion in space would dramatically amplify the Van Allen radiation belts, the natural zones of charged particles that surround Earth. That amplified radiation would then slowly and relentlessly degrade every unprotected satellite in low Earth orbit over days, weeks, and even months. Some experts estimate those effects could persist for years, potentially making entire orbital zones completely unusable for a generation. One senior Space Command official said it plainly: if and when space is struck down, all of society is struck down. The scale of potential destruction is almost impossible to overstate. Today, there are over 10,000 active satellites in low Earth orbit. These include Starlink internet satellites, U.S. military reconnaissance birds, European communication systems, Chinese commercial platforms, GPS satellites, weather monitoring systems, and scientific research payloads. A single nuclear detonation in the right orbital position could destroy or disable up to 80% of all satellites in space simultaneously. General Whiting confirmed that number directly. Up to 10,000 satellites, approximately 80% of the entire global satellite network would be at risk. The immediate consequences would cascade through every sector of modern civilization. GPS, which underlies not just navigation, but financial transaction timing, air traffic control, and precision agriculture, would go dark. Satellite internet services like Starlink, which Ukraine and NATO forces depend on heavily for battlefield communications, would be wiped out. Military reconnaissance would be blinded. Weather forecasting systems would fail. Mobile networks would be disrupted. And the early warning systems that alert governments to incoming nuclear missile launches would be severely degraded. The US and NATO would, in an instant, lose the technological advantages they have spent decades and trillions of dollars building. That is precisely Russia's strategy, and General Whiting said so directly. He explained that Moscow views the United States and NATO as having an overwhelming advantage in conventional military capabilities, weapons precision, logistics, real-time intelligence, and that Russia is looking for ways to erase that advantage without engaging in a conventional war it would lose. By neutralizing Western space capabilities, Whiting said, Russia believes it can level the battlefield, destroy the satellites, and you blind the most powerful conventional military on Earth. You strip away America's ability to coordinate precision strikes, track enemy movements, and communicate securely across theaters of war. In military terms, it is the perfect asymmetric weapon. Now, let's talk about what the US has already found in orbit, because the intelligence here goes beyond theory. In February 2022, Russia launched a satellite designated Cosmos 25553. U.S. intelligence officials say this satellite has been in orbit for over 2 years now, and they believe it is a test bed, a prototype vehicle related to Russia's nuclear space weapon program. Its orbit immediately attracted attention from U.S. analysts because it was placed in an unusually high radiation environment within low Earth orbit, an area not used by any other spacecraft. Russia claimed the satellite was there for materials testing. U.S. officials did not find that explanation credible. The radiation levels in Cosmos 2553's orbit are high, but not high enough to justify the kind of radiation endurance testing Moscow described. Then, in May 2024, Russia launched another satellite, Cosmos 2576. The U.S. Space Command assessed it as likely a counter-space weapon presumably capable of attacking other satellites in low Earth orbit. Most remarkably, Russia deployed Cosmos 2576 into the exact same orbital plane as a classified U.S. government satellite. Space analysts immediately identified that its orbit allowed the Russian craft to track, monitor, and potentially close in on the American satellite. This was not an accident. This was Russia demonstrating, in plain view of every satellite tracker on Earth, that it has the capability to stalk and approach American assets in space. And these are just the satellites the public knows about. What U.S. intelligence knows classified, and what was discussed in a secret war game just concluded last month, is almost certainly far more alarming. That war game is called Apollo Insight. And it is the clearest signal yet of how seriously Washington is taking this threat. In March 2026, U.S. Space Command conducted the first in a series of classified tabletop exercises in Colorado Springs. The exercise was not a small internal drill. It involved officials from 17 different U.S. government agencies. It included military participants from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, America's closest Five Eyes intelligence allies. And it brought in more than 60 private defense companies to work through the problem from an industrial and commercial standpoint. The central scenario of Apollo Insight was this: Russia detonates a nuclear device in low Earth orbit. What happens next? How does the U.S. government respond? What commercial systems survive? What can be done to protect critical infrastructure? How do NATO allies coordinate without satellite communications? According to General Whiting, who revealed the exercise publicly at the Space Symposium this week, participants came away with a better understanding and awareness of the seriousness of potential threats. That is diplomatic language for the results were sobering. One senior official at the Aerospace Corporation summarized the takeaway this way: participants left eager to share ideas on how they could contribute to solving the problem. 3 more Apollo Insight exercises are planned throughout 2026, covering orbital maneuver warfare, proliferated satellite constellations, and missile defense in the Arctic. The U.S. military is not treating this as a future problem. It is treating this as an active, present-tense threat that requires immediate preparation. Now, there are counterpoints worth addressing, because intellectual honesty demands it. Several defense analysts have pointed out that a nuclear detonation in orbit would not discriminate between Russian and Western satellites. Russia itself operates thousands of satellites that would be destroyed in such an attack. China, Russia's most important strategic partner, would also lose significant orbital assets. The chaos created in low Earth orbit from debris and radiation would affect Russian space operations for years. This reality leads some experts to argue that Russia would never actually use such a weapon, because the self-inflicted damage would be catastrophic. Victoria Sampson, a space security specialist at the Secure World Foundation, has said she would be very surprised if Russia were to actually deploy or use such a weapon, precisely because it would effectively cut off space access for Russia itself. The weapon, in her assessment, functions more as a threat tool, a deterrent designed to make Western militaries think twice before escalating in a conflict, rather than something Moscow would actually trigger. Other analysts note that developing and demonstrating the capability is itself a form of coercive power, even if the weapon is never fired. Russia's official position remains consistent denial. Vladimir Putin has publicly stated that Moscow has no intention of deploying nuclear weapons in space. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov dismissed the U.S. allegations as fake news from Washington. The Kremlin's position is that any weaponization of space is something Russia opposes, a position it has advanced through multiple UN Security Council resolutions on space arms control, though with obvious contradictions given what U.S. intelligence is observing in orbit. What is also true is that deploying a nuclear weapon in space would clearly violate the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which both the United States and Russia signed. Article 4 of that treaty explicitly prohibits placing nuclear weapons or any other weapons of mass destruction in Earth orbit. Russia vetoed a UN Security Council resolution in April 2024 that would have reaffirmed those prohibitions. The veto itself was widely interpreted as a signal that Moscow wanted to preserve its freedom of action in space, a diplomatic maneuver that alarmed Western governments. There is also a crucial technical distinction that experts are debating. Some analysts believe Russia is not developing a traditional nuclear warhead to be detonated in orbit. Instead, they suggest the system may be a nuclear-powered device, one that uses a nuclear reactor to generate intense directed energy or jamming capabilities to blind and disable satellites without actually detonating a bomb. This would be a technically more controllable and legally more ambiguous system, but the effect on Western satellite networks could still be devastating. General Whiting's warning about the payload of any future nuclear-armed satellite raises a chilling additional point. The warhead cannot be identified from the outside until it is detonated. In other words, Russia could launch a satellite that looks completely peaceful from the outside, park it in an advantageous orbit next to critical Western assets, and the United States would have no definitive way to know what it is carrying until the moment it goes off. That is the nature of the threat that America is now grappling with. The implications for everyday life deserve to be stated clearly. Most people do not think about satellites until they stop working, but the modern world runs on orbital infrastructure in ways that are invisible until they disappear. Your phone's GPS uses satellites. Your bank's transaction timestamps use satellites. The weather forecast you check every morning is built on satellite data. Emergency responders use satellite communications. Commercial aviation is guided partly by satellite navigation. The supply chains that put food on your shelves are managed using satellite tracking. Remove 80% of that infrastructure in a single instant, and the disruption to daily life would be profound, immediate, and sustained. This is why the U.S. Senate has been sounding alarms about the national defense strategy's failure to adequately address this threat. Critics in Congress have pointed out that the strategy barely mentions Russia's potential nuclear space weapon, even as General Whiting's Space Command is running classified war games to prepare for exactly that scenario. The gap between what the military knows and what official policy acknowledges is generating real friction inside Washington. What we know for certain right now, as of April 2026, is this. The United States Space Command has publicly confirmed that Russia is working on a nuclear anti-satellite capability. A classified war game involving more than 60 companies and America's closest allies was just completed, with Russia's weapon as the central scenario. At least 2 Russian satellites, Cosmos 2553 and Cosmos 2576, have been assessed as likely related to Russian counterspace programs. And the head of U.S. Space Command has said on the record in front of the global defense community that this is a report they are very concerned about and a development they just couldn't tolerate. The race to control space, the domain that all modern warfare, commerce, and communication depends on, has entered a new and far more dangerous phase. Nuclear weapons are no longer just a terrestrial threat pointed at cities and military bases. They may soon be orbiting above every country on Earth, positioned to take down the invisible infrastructure that holds the modern world together. The question is not whether this is real. The evidence says it is. The question is whether the world is prepared for what comes next.